Transplant tourism. In 1984, the United States passed the National Organ Transplant Act, establishing our current system of organ transplantation. But our current system is flawed. According to KidneyLink, the only comprehensive resource for kidney donors, reports the average wait time for an organ donation is 3 to 5 years on the federal wait list. And according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, approximately 18 people die every day on this wait list. And every 10 minutes, another person is added to the wait list, as this graph shows. Now, transplant tourism is a phenomenon that refers to patients on the wait list who decide to travel to other countries in order to buy organs for transplantation. The transplant tourism is quickly becoming popular as the demand for organs only grows in the U.S. After foreign operations, however, many transplant tourists need post-operative care from U.S. doctors. Sometimes due to acute rejection rates of the foreign transplant, patients even require entirely new organs from limited U.S. reserves in order to stay alive. Thus, it comes into question whether U.S. doctors should be allowed to refuse such patients. Ultimately, due to its medical, ethical, and social factors, U.S. doctors should be allowed to refuse such requests.
The risks of traveling to other countries for transplants are not unknown, but transplant tourism seems to be the remedy for long wait periods or disqualification from the domestic transplantation program. In a controlled study that compared tourists to domestic recipients of an organ transplant, a UCLA medical team found that 52% of tourists in the study had infections upon returning to the U.S. 39% of the tourists needed hospitalization, and one tourist even died from donor-contracted illness. Due to these complications encountered by tourists, U.S. doctors are facing more tourists than ever before.
As the demand for organs grows, the amount of U.S. donors increases at a lesser rate. Keith Humphreys of the Washington Post reports that about 30 Americans a day either die on the waiting list or removed from it because they become too ill to receive a transplant. The organ shortage forces patients to spend months, or more often years, on the wait list in hopes of receiving an organ. Of the 120,000 members enrolled in the National Organ Transplant Program, U.S. surgeon Pauline Chen notes that about 7,000 of them die each year because of the organ shortage, as this graph depicts. Numerous individuals frustrated with the shortage often turn to transplant tourism, possibly taking away the chance of another individual to receive an organ if they return ill. By giving a new organ to a transplant tourist in critical health, those patients are limiting the ability for another patient to undergo an organ transplant. There is simply not enough organs to go around. In order to maintain a level playing field, as is their medical duty, doctors should be allowed to refuse patients who received risky transplantation abroad.
However, doctors do have an obligation to their patients. The main debate regarding this issue typically circulates around the issue of ethics. Dr. Schiano of Mount Sinai School of Medicine tells ABC News that by retransplanting a patient, we're going to take a liver away from another patient on the waiting list who may die because they didn't get that organ. When transplant tourists need another organ, it is at the liberty of the doctors to decide whether or not that patient should receive precedence over someone who has not traveled. Additionally, Linda Wright, Director of Bioethics at University Health Network Toronto, explains that the more transplant patients doctors treat, the demands for organs will only increase. This, in turn, will encourage organ brokers to resort to unethical means to obtain organs for profit. Thus, the ethicality of the issue becomes increasingly complex as it extends past the limits of the operating table. It is a moral obligation of American doctors to treat and assist their patients in times of need.
But everyone deserves an equal and fair chance at receiving an organ. When examining this issue from a social approach, it is most vital to keep in mind the desires of society. The dictionary definition of society is to create order and community amongst people that share similar values. For Americans, these values include equality, justice, and opportunity. As society encompasses a vast body of people with varying opinions, the considerations of the majority must be given the most weight. And in this case, the patients on the wait list are the majority, not the transplant tourists. Though it may be morally difficult for a doctor to refuse a patient in such a precarious situation, the decision can still be justified if society benefits. Our culture expects a certain standard of fairness in such dilemmas, and it should be up to the doctor to determine the fairest procedure to be taken, which may include refusal of the patient. Now, two different perspectives must be considered in this dilemma. The first, the doctor's perspective reveals the medical obligation of physicians to attend to their patients, but also portrays their ethical desire to help those who wait. With the shortage of organ donors, doctors must consider the best possible candidates for each and every organ. The patient's perspective typically will favor themselves due to their precarious life and death situation, whether they admit their fault in bypassing the system or not. The doctor's view focuses on the best option for an entire community of patients, while individual patients focus on their own needs.
The obvious solution to this problem is to disallow patients from turning to transplant tourism, but that solution isn't plausible. Because we cannot regulate policies of organ transplants in countries abroad or control the actions of the patient, we advocate for the following policy. Private practitioners should be allowed to refuse patients who have undergone transplantation overseas and return in need of medical assistance. This refusal should be limited to giving the tourist a new organ, not from treatment altogether. However, it should be a requirement to place the patient on life support, even if transplantation is refused. We acknowledge that this may create backlash from patients in desperate need of assistance, but it must be recognized that the refusal is garnered towards the larger population. This implicates that American doctors and the American health system must value the majority over the individual.
Why doctors still have a moral obligation to their patients. Transplant tourists that face organ failure must recognize that their decision to go abroad placed them medically at risk. Considering the unfair ability for tourists to take away organs from patients in need, and society's desire for equal opportunities, United States doctors should be allowed to refuse patients who travel overseas to undergo transplantation. Thank you.
Emily, let's start with you. As you were doing your research, was there anything that you struggled to find, any information you struggled to find, and how did you get around that?
Well, overall, it was a little bit of a challenge to find trustworthy information because transplant tourism in itself is a practice that's frowned upon, and a lot of the times the tourists are obtaining organs that organ brokers have got through unethical and illegal means, and so of course these unlawful practices aren't going to be documented that well, and we wish we could have found more first-hand accounts from tourists who had actually traveled to receive an organ.
Okay. Tara, can you talk to me a little bit more about the implications of your solution? If a doctor were to refuse to allow or to treat someone who had undergone transplant tourism, the hospital puts them on life support indefinitely. Can you talk about how you envision that working?
Yes, well, a lot of patients are already being put on life support because they're not able to receive an organ, like Griffin talked about in the introduction. So by putting a different patient, a transplant tourist, on life support, you'd be able to give an organ to a patient who's been on the wait list. So really, it's not by adding more patients to the hospital or keeping them indefinitely, but then if the patient who transplant tourist who be put on life support, definitely they would obviously be talking to the family and other people that are related to that individual.
Okay. Griffin, can you talk to me a little bit about what you've learned through this process of the dry run and how you're going to use that in the real thing?
Like through the process or
Whole
like
process.
information?
No, the process.
The process,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I think one of our biggest problems that we definitely faced was the time component because we all have very impacted schedules, and of course we knew that going into it, but it was still really difficult to like plan that ahead. Oh, hey, I can't meet on Saturday, so we gotta meet this Friday instead or whatever. And I think we ran into that issue a little bit with our scheduling. And not that it impacted us that we weren't able to work around it, but I think we lay out an entire schedule for like the month that we're working on the group project, then we'll be able to better meet those like needs and whatever. And so I think that was definitely an important discovery, and also just the way that we split up like what we were doing, you know, lead writer, lead presentation, and lead script, or yeah, lead researcher. That's the three that we were like supposed to split up. We didn't quite do it like in that manner, and I think maybe that would have been more beneficial, so there was more distinct like roles.
Thank you.